He thought his human bride was weak, until she defeated the rival Alpha King in a royal duel. The knife was already at her throat when Elena realized the wedding feast had turned into a trap. One moment she had been standing beside Damien, the Alpha King, accepting the toasts of strangers who did not want her there. The next, a hooded man had broken through the guards, moved faster than anyone in the hall could react, and pressed a blade to her skin. The music stopped. Goblets froze halfway to open mouths. Somewhere behind her, a woman screamed. Elena did not scream. She did not close her eyes. She watched the man's wrist, the small tremor in his grip, the way his weight sat too far forward on his back foot. And when he shifted just slightly to glance at the doorway, she moved. She caught his forearm, twisted it away from her neck, and drove her elbow into his ribs, with a force that made the entire hall go silent. He staggered. She stepped into the space he left behind, hooked his leg, and put him on the floor before a single guard had crossed half the room. By the time Damien reached her side, sword drawn, the intruder was already pinned beneath her knee, gasping for air. For a long moment, nobody spoke. Damien stared at his new wife, at the calm in her eyes, at the blood on her white wedding gown that was not her own. He had married her 3 hours earlier, believing she was nothing more than a fragile human sent to seal a truce. He had been wrong, and he was only beginning to understand how wrong. 3 days earlier, Elena had been a stranger to this world entirely. She grew up in a quiet town far from the packs and their politics, raised by a grandmother who never spoke about the past, and a father who left when she was young. She trained in secret from the age of 12, first with an old instructor who taught her balance and patience, later on her own, driven by something she could never quite explain. She told herself it was for safety. Deep down, she always sensed there was a reason waiting for her, one she had not yet discovered. When the envoys arrived at her door speaking of alliances, pacts, and a king who needed a human bride to end a war before it began, she almost laughed. It sounded like something from an old story, but the men who came for her were not ordinary men. Their eyes held a golden shimmer in candlelight, and their movements were too fast, too silent, too controlled. She understood, in that moment, that the world she had always sensed beneath the surface of things was real, and it had finally found her. She was given 2 days to prepare. 2 days to leave behind everything she knew and step into a role she had never imagined for herself. Her grandmother, frail and quiet, took her hand before she left and said only one sentence that Elena would carry with her for the rest of her life. You were always meant for more than they can see. The journey to the royal stronghold took a full day by carriage, through forests that grew darker and older the further they traveled. Elena watched the trees pass by the window, memorizing the turns, the distances, the shape of the land. It was a habit she could not break, this quiet cataloging of her surroundings, this need to always know where the exits were. The stronghold itself rose out of the mountainside, like something carved by nature rather than built by hands. Stone towers stretched toward a sky heavy with clouds. Banners bearing a silver wolf snapped in the wind above the gates. Elena stepped down from the carriage and felt hundreds of eyes on her before she had even crossed the courtyard. Alpha King Damien stood at the top of the stone steps, tall and broad-shouldered, his expression unreadable. He wore his authority the way other men wore armor, effortless and absolute. When their eyes met, Elena felt the weight of his gaze move over her, assessing, measuring, and ultimately dismissing her as something small. She was used to being underestimated. It had never bothered her before. She told herself it would not bother her now. The wedding was arranged for the following evening, a rushed affair meant to satisfy the terms of the truce before either side could change its mind. Elena spent the hours before the ceremony alone, in a guest chamber, staring out a narrow window at the mountains beyond the walls. A young woman named Piper, one of the palace attendants, helped her into the wedding gown, her hands nervous, her eyes darting toward the door, as though she expected trouble at any moment.
You do not have to be afraid of me, Elena said gently, noticing the girl's tension. It is not you I fear, my lady, Piper whispered.
It is what waits outside these walls. Elena wanted to ask what she meant, but before she could, the doors opened, and it was time. The ceremony was brief and cold. Damien spoke his vows in a flat, practiced tone, his eyes fixed somewhere over Elena's shoulder rather than on her face. She matched his tone, refusing to let anyone in that hall see anything resembling nerves or hope. When the ceremony ended, they were declared bound, king and queen, though neither of them looked at the other as though the word meant anything at all. The feast that followed was where everything changed. Long tables filled the great hall, laden with food and wine, though the atmosphere carried more tension than celebration. Members of the council watched Elena, with expressions ranging from curiosity to open contempt. She caught fragments of whispered conversations as she passed. Words like weak and human and mistake drifted toward her from every direction, and she absorbed each one without reaction, filing them away the way she filed away everything else. Damien's second in command, a broad-shouldered man named Marcus, made no effort to hide his disapproval. He watched Elena from across the hall with narrowed eyes, arms crossed over his chest, as though daring her to prove herself worthy of the crown she now wore. "She is a liability," Elena heard him mutter to another council member. "The king has bound himself to someone who cannot even defend her own life, let alone a kingdom." Elena said nothing. She lifted her cup, took a slow sip of wine, and continued watching the room, cataloging faces, exits, and the subtle shifts of power moving between the guests, like currents beneath still water. It was during the third course, as servers moved between the tables with trays of roasted meat, that the hooded man made his move. He had been posing as one of the kitchen staff, slipping past the outer guards with practiced ease. Nobody noticed him until he was already behind Elena's chair, blade drawn, arm wrapping around her from behind. The hall erupted into chaos. Guards shouted. Chairs scraped back. Damien rose to his feet so quickly, his own chair toppled behind him, his hand already reaching for the sword at his hip. But Elena moved first. She felt the cold edge of the blade against her throat and understood, with perfect clarity, that hesitation would cost her everything. Years of quiet training in an empty barn behind her grandmother's house rose to the surface, instinct taking over where fear might have paralyzed anyone else. She caught his wrist, twisted, and used his own momentum against him, throwing him off balance long enough to strike. The fight lasted only seconds. By the time Damien reached her, the intruder lay pinned beneath her knee, disarmed and gasping, his blade skittering harmlessly across the stone floor. The hall fell into stunned silence. Damien stared down at his bride, sword still raised, though there was no longer any threat left to face. Blood from a shallow cut on her collarbone stained the white fabric of her gown, but she did not tremble. She did not cry out. She simply looked up at him, breathing steady, and said the only thing that came to mind. "He is still breathing. You may want to ask him who sent him before that changes." Marcus stepped forward first, ordering the guards to seize the attacker and clear the hall. Whispers rippled through the crowd as guests were ushered toward the doors, glancing back at Elena with expressions no longer filled with contempt, but something closer to confusion, even wonder. Damien sheathed his sword slowly, his eyes never leaving her face. "Who taught you to fight like that?" he asked, his voice quieter now, stripped of its earlier detachment. Elena rose to her feet, smoothing the front of her ruined gown with steady hands. "Does it matter?" she replied. "You already decided who I was before I arrived. Perhaps it is time you looked again." She walked past him without waiting for a response, leaving him standing amid the wreckage of a feast that had revealed far more than either of them had expected on their wedding night. Behind her, Marcus knelt beside the captured intruder, pulling back his hood to reveal a face none of them recognized. But the mark tattooed on the inside of his wrist, a jagged symbol shaped like a broken crown, was one that made several of the older council members go pale. "That mark belongs to the Castor territory," one of them murmured. This was no random attack, this was a message. Damien's jaw tightened as he turned toward the captured man. "Then let him answer for it," he said coldly. "And let word reach Castor that the bride he tried to have killed on her wedding night is very much alive, and far from the weak human he assumed her to be." Across the hall, unseen by anyone else in the chaos, Elena paused at the doorway and looked back one final time. Her eyes met Damien's for a brief moment, and in that look, something shifted between them, something neither of them yet had words for. She did not know it then, but the man who tried to kill her that night had been sent not out of random cruelty, but as the opening move in a conflict that had been building for years, one that would eventually force her into the greatest fight of her life. A fight against a king, far more dangerous than the assassin who had failed tonight. A fight that would decide not only her fate, but the fate of two kingdoms locked in a war neither side could afford to lose. For now, she only knew one thing with certainty, as she walked alone through the cold stone corridors toward her new chambers, blood still drying on her collarbone. They had underestimated her once. They would not get the chance to do it again. Later that night, alone in her new chambers, Elena finally allowed herself to sit down. Her hands, steady throughout the entire ordeal, now trembled slightly as the adrenaline began to fade. She was not afraid of the attacker. She had faced fear before, quietly, alone, in the years of training nobody had witnessed. What unsettled her was the realization that she had crossed into a world where danger did not wait for invitations. It arrived at wedding feasts. It hid behind kitchen trays. It wore hoods and carried marks belonging to kings she had never met. A soft knock came at her door. She rose, expecting Piper, but instead found Marcus standing in the hallway, his expression unreadable in the flickering torchlight. "The king wishes to know if you require a healer," he said stiffly, as though the words cost him something to speak. "I am fine," Elena answered. "Tell him I do not need looking after." Marcus studied her for a long moment, his earlier disdain replaced by something more cautious. "That was a clean disarm," he said finally. "Where a soldier might have hesitated, you did not." "I have spent my whole life being told to hesitate," Elena replied. "I decided a long time ago that I would not." Marcus said nothing more, but as he turned to leave, she caught the faint trace of something new in his expression. Not quite respect, but no longer outright dismissal either. It was a start. She closed the door and leaned against it, closing her eyes for the first time since the ceremony began. Somewhere beyond these walls, a king named Castor had sent a man to kill her before she had even finished her first night as queen. She did not know his face. She did not know his reasons, beyond the ancient rivalry Damien's people spoke of in hushed tones. But she understood, with the same clarity that had guided her hand during the attack, that this would not be the last time their paths crossed. Whatever waited for her in the days ahead, she intended to meet it standing, not kneeling. She had spent her entire life being underestimated, dismissed, treated as smaller than she was. Tonight had proven, to herself if to no one else, that the strength she carried inside her was real, and it was only beginning to surface. She rose from where she had been resting, walked to the window, and looked out over the dark mountains surrounding her new home. Somewhere out there, in a kingdom she had never seen, a rival king believed he had already won the first move, in a war she had not even known she was part of. He was wrong, and soon, everyone in both kingdoms would come to understand exactly how wrong he was. For now, she allowed herself one slow breath, one moment of stillness before the storm she sensed building on the horizon. Tomorrow would bring questions, suspicion, and the beginning of a transformation that would carry her far beyond the woman who had arrived in that courtyard only a day before. Tonight, she simply stood at the window, unafraid, and waited for the sun to rise on the first true day of a life she had never imagined for herself, but one she was already beginning to claim as her own. Morning arrived with a pale gray light that stretched across the mountains outside Elena's window. She had barely slept, her mind replaying the events of the previous night in careful detail, searching for anything she might have missed. The mark on the assassin's wrist. The way Damien's expression had shifted from cold detachment to something unreadable. The whispered word Castor passing between the council members like a warning nobody wanted to say aloud. A knock at her door pulled her from her thoughts. Piper entered, carrying a simple gray dress and an expression far more relaxed than the tension from the night before. "The king has requested your presence in the war chamber," Piper said, setting the dress across the bed. "He said it was urgent." Elena dressed quickly, her mind already turning over what urgency might mean, in a place where assassins arrived disguised as servants. She followed Piper through corridors lined with old tapestries, depicting battles long past, images of wolves locked in combat beneath banners she did not recognize. The war chamber sat at the heart of the stronghold, a circular room, with a long stone table at its center, maps spread across its surface, weighted down with iron markers shaped like small wolves. Damien stood at the head of the table when she entered, along with Marcus and two other council members she had not yet met, an older woman named Nora with sharp eyes and silver hair, and a younger man named Colin who kept glancing nervously between Elena and the king. "You wanted to see me," Elena said, stepping into the room without waiting for permission to speak. Damien gestured toward the table. The man who attacked you last night was interrogated through the early hours of the morning. He has confirmed what the mark on his wrist suggested. He was sent by Castor. Elena studied the map before her, noting the borders marked in red ink, the distance between Damien's territory and the neighboring lands ruled by the man responsible for last night's attack. Why would he risk an act of war before the truce has even had a chance to settle? She asked. Because Castor does not believe this truce will hold, Nora answered, her voice measured and careful. He has spent years building his strength, waiting for an opportunity to challenge Damien's claim over the northern territories. A human bride, in his eyes, was proof that our king had weakened, that the pack itself had grown soft enough to bind its future to someone who could not fight. He assumed wrong, Marcus said quietly, surprising everyone in the room, including Elena. What she did last night was not the reaction of a weak woman. Damien's eyes moved to Elena, studying her with the same intensity he had shown the night before, though the dismissal she had seen in his gaze during the wedding ceremony had been replaced by something more careful, more curious. I need to understand what I am dealing with, he said. Who trained you? Why a human woman fights like someone raised inside these walls rather than outside them? Elena considered her answer carefully. She had spent years keeping her training private, a secret even from her own family beyond the man who had first taught her. She was not ready to share everything, not with strangers, not even with the man she had married only a day earlier. I taught myself to survive, she said finally. That is all you need to know for now. Colin shifted uncomfortably at the vague answer, but Nora only nodded slowly, as though she understood something the others did not. Whatever the reason, she said, it does not change the danger we now face. Castor will not stop with a single failed attempt. He will see this as an insult to be corrected, and men like him do not let insults stand for long. The room fell into a tense silence. Elena studied the map again, tracing the border between the two territories with her eyes, calculating distances, terrain, the number of days it would take an army to cross from one side to the other. What does he want? She asked, beyond simply proving a point. Damien's jaw tightened. He wants the northern territories. He has wanted them for years, land rich with resources our people depend upon. The truce your marriage sealed was meant to prevent him from taking them by force. If he believes this marriage is built on weakness, he will move against us before winter, certain that we cannot hold the line. Then we make certain he understands otherwise, Elena said simply. Every eye in the room turned toward her. Marcus raised an eyebrow, clearly skeptical. Colin looked as though he wanted to object but thought better of it. Damien, however, studied her expression carefully, searching for any trace of bravado or fear beneath her calm exterior, and finding neither. You speak as though you intend to be part of that answer, he said. I am your wife and your queen now, whether either of us chose it freely or not, Elena replied. I did not come here to hide behind these walls while others decide my fate for me. If Castor believes I am a weakness to be exploited, then perhaps it is time he learns exactly how wrong that belief is. Marcus exchanged a glance with Nora, something unspoken passing between them. Damien said nothing for a long moment, his gaze fixed on Elena as though seeing her for the first time, not as a political obligation forced upon him by circumstances beyond his control, but as someone who might actually stand beside him rather than behind him. We will discuss your role once we understand the full scope of the threat, he said finally, though his tone carried less dismissal than it had the day before. For now, I want increased guards around the stronghold, and I want eyes on every road leading from Castor's territory into ours. The meeting continued for another hour, strategies discussed, defenses reviewed, messengers dispatched to gather information from allied territories. Elena listened carefully throughout, absorbing details about the pack's structure, its history, the delicate balance of power that had kept an uneasy peace for years before her arrival threatened to upset it entirely. When the meeting finally ended, the council members filed out one by one, leaving Elena and Damien alone in the war chamber for the first time since their wedding. You surprised me last night, Damien said quietly, once the door had closed behind the others. You assumed I would be helpless, Elena replied. That was your mistake, not mine. I assumed many things, he admitted, his voice carrying an honesty she had not expected from him. I am beginning to understand how wrong those assumptions were. Elena studied him carefully, searching for sincerity beneath the words. She found it, buried beneath years of guarded caution, the same instinct toward self-protection she recognized in herself. If we are going to survive whatever comes next, she said, we cannot afford to keep secrets from each other. I do not know everything about your world yet, but I intend to learn quickly, and you will need to trust that I am capable of more than you initially believed. Damien nodded slowly, something shifting in his expression that resembled the beginning of respect. Then let us begin with the truth, he said. Castor will not wait long before testing us again. When he does, I need to know you are prepared for what may come, not just from assassins in the shadows, but potentially from him directly, should this conflict escalate beyond what either of us can control. Elena held his gaze steadily, the weight of his words settling over her like the first true understanding of what she had walked into. Then we prepare, she said, together. For the first time since her arrival, Damien allowed the faintest trace of something resembling approval to cross his face. It was not warmth, not yet, but it was a beginning, a small crack in the wall he had built around himself since the day the truce had first been proposed. Outside the war chamber, unaware of the conversation taking place within, whispers had already begun spreading through the stronghold. Word of the assassination attempt, and the queen's unexpected skill in defending herself, traveled quickly among the guards, the servants, and eventually the wider pack itself. By evening, the woman many had dismissed as a fragile political pawn was being spoken of in entirely different terms, terms that carried a mixture of curiosity, respect, and quiet unease. Elena did not know it yet, but her actions during that first chaotic night had already begun rewriting the story others believed about her. And far away, in a stronghold carved from darker stone beneath a colder sky, King Castor received word of his failed assassin's capture, with a fury that promised the coming conflict would only grow more dangerous from here. He had expected an easy target. What he received instead was the first sign that the war he intended to win, without much effort, might prove far more difficult than he had ever imagined. Word of the failed assassination reached Castor's stronghold before the sun had fully set on the following day. He received the news in his private hall, seated upon a throne carved from black stone, surrounded by advisors who knew better than to speak until spoken to. When the messenger finished recounting what little was known, that the assassin had been captured, that the human bride had somehow defended herself without assistance, Castor said nothing for a long moment. Then he rose from his throne, crossed the hall in 3 long strides, and struck the messenger across the face hard enough to send him to the floor. "You sent me a fool," he said quietly, his voice more dangerous for its calm than any shout could have been. "A fool who failed against a human woman with no training, no pack blood, nothing but soft hands and softer bones." The messenger did not answer. Nobody in that hall dared answer. Castor turned away, staring into the fire burning in the hearth along the far wall, his mind already working through the implications of what had happened. He had expected the attempt to succeed easily, expected Damien's human bride to fall the moment a blade touched her skin, expected the message it would send to every territory watching this fragile truce unfold. Instead, he had handed his rival a story of strength rather than weakness, a story that would spread through allied lands and make his own position look foolish by comparison. "This complicates matters," said an older man seated near the fire, an advisor named Grant who had served Castor's family for decades and possessed a rare willingness to speak honestly, even when his king's temper ran hot. "If the human woman truly defended herself as described, the perception you hope to create has already begun working against you." "Then we create a new perception," Castor said, turning back toward the room, "one that cannot be so easily overcome by a single lucky moment of self-defense." "What do you propose?" Grant asked carefully. Castor's eyes narrowed, calculating possibilities with the patience of a man who had spent years building toward this exact moment of opportunity. "I propose we test her properly," he said. "Not through hidden blades and shadows, but through something impossible to dismiss as luck. Something that will reveal exactly what she is capable of, in full view of both our territories." Grant frowned, sensing where this line of thinking might lead. "You cannot mean to challenge her directly. Royal law does not permit combat against an untested human, regardless of any skill she may have shown." Royal law permits many things when the right circumstances are presented, Castor replied, a slow, calculating smile spreading across his face. There are older laws, forgotten by most, that speak to matters of honor and challenge between royal households. If the right insult were delivered, publicly, undeniably, it would fall to her, or to Damien on her behalf, to answer it according to those same ancient traditions. Grant's frown deepened. And if she refuses to answer, or if Damien answers for her instead, then Damien's pride forces him into a fight he cannot afford to lose, weakening his position regardless of the outcome, Castor said. But if she is truly as capable as the reports suggest, she may choose to answer the challenge herself. And when she does, I intend to be certain the outcome favors us far more than a single failed assassin ever could have. Across the room, a younger woman seated near the window had remained silent throughout the exchange, her expression thoughtful rather than fearful. Her name was Lydia, Castor's younger sister, and unlike most in his court, she possessed a mind sharp enough to see beyond her brother's immediate anger toward the larger game unfolding around them. "You are underestimating her already," Lydia said quietly, drawing every eye in the room toward her. Castor turned, his expression hardening at the interruption. "Explain yourself. You sent a man to kill a woman you believed to be weak, and instead, she defeated him without assistance. In front of an entire hall of witnesses," Lydia said. "Now you intend to publicly challenge her again, based on the assumption that whatever skill she showed was some kind of fortunate accident. What if it was not an accident, brother? What if she is exactly as dangerous as her actions suggest?" Castor's jaw tightened, though he did not immediately dismiss his sister's words the way he might have dismissed anyone else in the room. Lydia had proven herself right about matters others had overlooked before, and even a king as proud as Castor understood the value of listening when she spoke. "Then we will simply have to ensure the terms of any challenge favor us regardless of her ability," he said finally. "A royal duel carries rules, traditions, weapons chosen by careful negotiation. If she is skilled with her hands, we ensure the challenge favors something else entirely. If she has trained in one discipline, we choose terms that expose her weakness in another." Lydia said nothing further, though her expression remained thoughtful, unconvinced that her brother's confidence was as well-founded as he believed. Meanwhile, far to the north, within the walls of Damien's stronghold, Elena had begun a transformation of her own, one driven by instinct rather than any knowledge of the plans forming against her in Castor's hall. She spent her mornings observing the pack's warriors as they trained in the courtyard below her window, studying their movements with the same careful attention she had once given to her own private lessons years earlier. She noticed patterns in their footwork, weaknesses in their guard positions, strengths she recognized from her own training, and others entirely foreign to her. By the third day, she had begun rising before dawn to practice alone, in a quiet corner of the training grounds, moving through forms she had learned long ago, refining techniques that had grown rusty during the months leading up to her marriage. She believed herself unwatched during these early hours, the courtyard empty except for the occasional guard patrolling the outer walls. She was wrong. Damien had taken to rising early himself in the days following the assassination attempt, unable to sleep as his mind turned over the growing threat from Castor's territory. On the fourth morning, he stepped onto the balcony overlooking the training grounds and found himself frozen in place, watching his human bride move through a sequence of strikes and defensive positions, with a precision that spoke of years of dedicated practice, not the desperate improvisation of someone acting purely on instinct during a moment of danger. He watched in silence for nearly 20 minutes, studying the controlled power behind each movement, the discipline in her breathing, the way she corrected small errors in her own form, without any instructor present to guide her. When she finally paused, breathing steady despite the intensity of her practice, he found himself questioning everything he had believed about the woman he had married. She is not merely defending herself when threatened, he thought. She has spent years preparing for something. But what, and why? He did not approach her that morning, choosing instead to retreat quietly, before she noticed his presence, uncertain what to say or how to ask the questions building in his mind. But from that morning forward, he began watching her more closely during their shared meals, their brief conversations, the moments when their paths crossed within the walls of the stronghold, searching for clues about the woman beneath the calm, guarded exterior she presented to the world. Elena, for her part, remained unaware of exactly how much he had observed. though she sensed a shift in his behavior, a quality of attention that felt different from the dismissive assessment she had grown used to during their first days together. She did not know what had changed, only that something had, and she found herself, despite every instinct toward caution, curious about what lay beneath the cold exterior Damien presented to the rest of his court. On the 5th day since the assassination attempt, a messenger arrived at the stronghold gates, carrying a sealed letter bearing Castor's personal crest, a black wolf howling beneath a broken crown. The council gathered quickly in the war chamber, as Damien broke the seal and read the contents aloud, his expression darkening with each line. The letter, formal in its language but unmistakable in its intent, contained a public insult directed at Elena, questioning her worthiness to sit beside a king, mocking the very idea that a human woman could offer anything of value to a pack built on strength and tradition. It ended with an invitation, worded carefully within the boundaries of ancient law, for either Damien or his bride to answer the insult through formal challenge at a gathering of allied territories scheduled to take place within the month. The room fell into stunned silence as Damien finished reading. Marcus was the first to speak, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. "This is exactly what Castor intended from the beginning," he said. "He failed to remove her through violence, so now he seeks to remove her through humiliation, forcing either you or her into a public confrontation designed to favor his own advantage." Nora nodded slowly, her expression grave. The ancient laws governing royal challenges have not been invoked in generations. Few remember the exact terms, the traditions surrounding weapon selection, the rules that govern such a duel. Castor has clearly studied them carefully in preparation for this moment. Elena, who had remained silent throughout the reading of the letter, finally spoke, her voice steady despite the weight of what had just been revealed. "I want to see the full text of these ancient laws," she said. "If I am the one being insulted, I intend to understand exactly what I am being invited into before anyone decides how we respond." Damien turned toward her, studying her expression carefully. "This is not a decision to make lightly, Elena. A royal duel is not a simple contest. It carries real danger, and Castor would not have proposed this path unless he believed the terms could be shaped to favor him." "I am aware of the danger," Elena replied. "But I am also aware that if you answer this challenge instead of me, you hand Castor exactly the outcome he hopes for, drawing you personally into a conflict that weakens your position, regardless of whether you win or lose. If there is another option, I want to understand it fully before we decide anything." The room fell silent again, every council member turning toward Damien, waiting to see how he would respond to his bride's quiet insistence on claiming a role nobody had expected her to seek. After a long moment, Damien nodded slowly, his expression unreadable, but his voice carrying a note of something that had not been present during their first meetings together, something that resembled respect. "Then we will study the old laws together," he said, "and we will decide, as equals, what path forward serves us best." For the first time since her arrival, Elena felt something shift within the walls of the stronghold she now called home. A sense that the man beside her was beginning to see her not as an obligation forced upon him by circumstance, but as someone capable of standing beside him in whatever battle lay ahead. Whether that battle would ultimately be fought with words, with strategy, or with something far more dangerous, remained to be seen. But as the council dispersed and preparations began for the difficult days ahead, one truth had already settled clearly in Elena's mind. Castor believed he was orchestrating a trap designed to expose her weakness before the watching eyes of every allied territory. What he did not yet understand was that the woman he intended to humiliate had spent her entire life preparing, without knowing why, for exactly this kind of impossible challenge. And she did not intend to disappoint whatever fate had been quietly shaping her for all these years. The ancient records room sat deep beneath the stronghold, reached by a narrow staircase that spiraled down into cool, quiet darkness. Elena followed Nora through the winding passage, torchlight flickering against walls lined with shelves of aged scrolls and leather-bound volumes, each one containing fragments of history stretching back centuries. "This is where the old laws are kept," Nora explained, running her fingers along a row of texts until she found the one she sought. "Most of what governs our people today comes from tradition passed down through word rather than written record. But certain matters of royal succession, of formal challenge and honor, were considered too important to risk to memory alone. She pulled a thick volume from the shelf, its cover worn smooth by generations of hands before theirs, and carried it to a wide table at the center of the room. Elena sat across from her as Nora carefully opened the pages, searching through dense, formal writing until she found the section she wanted. "Here," Nora said, turning the book toward Elena. "The Law of Royal Challenge. It states that any insult delivered publicly against the spouse of a ruling alpha may be answered through formal combat, provided both parties agree to the terms, and the challenge is witnessed by representatives of at least 3 allied territories." Elena studied the text carefully, though the old script required Nora's occasional translation of unfamiliar words and phrases. As she read, she began to understand the full weight of what Castor had set in motion. "It says here that the challenged party may choose the weapon," Elena said, pointing to a passage further down the page. "Correct," Nora confirmed. "Though the challenging party retains the right to reject any weapon deemed unreasonable, and a neutral arbiter, chosen by mutual agreement, ultimately decides what qualifies as fair. Which means Castor will attempt to reject anything that favors me, and push instead for something that favors him," Elena said, thinking aloud. Nora nodded gravely. "Castor is known for his skill with the warblade, a weapon requiring significant physical strength few humans could ever hope to match. If he can maneuver the terms toward that choice, he believes the outcome is already decided before the duel even begins." Elena leaned back in her chair, considering the problem carefully. "Then I need to choose something else, something he does not expect, and something the arbiter cannot easily reject as unreasonable." "What did your training focus on?" Nora asked, studying Elena with open curiosity for the first time since they had met. "You clearly possess skill beyond simple self-defense. I would like to understand what kind of skill that is." Elena hesitated, the old habit of secrecy still strong within her, but she recognized that continued silence would serve her poorly now, especially with so much at stake. "My instructor believed in efficiency over raw strength," she said finally. "Speed, precision, using an opponent's own force and size against them rather than attempting to match it directly. He taught me with a staff more than any bladed weapon, believing that control mattered more than the ability to cause harm." Nora's expression shifted, something like understanding crossing her features. "A staff is a traditional weapon within our own history as well, though it has fallen out of favor in recent generations, as warriors turn toward blades and physical strength. If you proposed the staff as your chosen weapon, it would carry historical legitimacy that Castor could not easily dismiss, even if it surprises him." "Then that is where we begin," Elena said, a quiet determination settling into her voice. Over the following days, preparations for the coming duel began in earnest, though carefully hidden from anyone beyond Damien's most trusted advisors. Elena spent her mornings continuing her private practice in the courtyard, no longer alone as Damien began joining her, initially to observe, but eventually to offer his own insight into techniques he had learned throughout his years leading the pack's warriors. Their early conversations remained formal, careful, two people still learning how to trust each other despite the strange circumstances that had bound their lives together. But slowly, through shared purpose, and the countless hours spent working toward the same goal, something began shifting between them. "You move differently than anyone I have trained with before," Damien observed one morning, watching Elena complete a complex sequence of strikes against a wooden practice post. "Most warriors in my pack rely on strength as their foundation. You rely on something else entirely. Strength alone only carries you so far," Elena replied, pausing to catch her breath. "My instructor always said that the strongest opponent is not always the most dangerous one. The most dangerous opponent is the one who understands exactly how to use whatever they have been given, no matter how limited it might seem to others." Damien considered this for a long moment, something thoughtful crossing his expression. "That is a wisdom many warriors never learn, even after years of training. Perhaps that is because most warriors are never forced to learn it the way I was," Elena said quietly, her tone carrying an edge of something she rarely allowed others to see. Damien did not press further, sensing the boundary she had drawn around whatever experiences had shaped her early years. Instead, he offered something of himself in return, a rare gesture from a man who had spent years guarding his own vulnerabilities as carefully as she guarded hers. "I was not always the king you see standing before you now," he said. "My older brother was meant to inherit this throne. I spent my early years believing I would never need to carry this weight, training instead simply because it was expected, never truly understanding why the discipline mattered, until circumstances forced that understanding upon me far too quickly. What happened to him? Elena asked gently. Damien's expression darkened slightly. He died defending our territory against an early conflict with Castor's father, years before either of us inherited the responsibilities we now carry. I was thrust into this role sooner than I was prepared for, and I have spent every year since trying to prove myself worthy of a crown I never expected to wear. Elena studied him carefully, recognizing something familiar in his words. A shared understanding of being forced into circumstances beyond one's control, and having to rise to meet them regardless of readiness. Then perhaps that is something we share, she said. Neither of us chose this path exactly as it unfolded, but perhaps that shared uncertainty is exactly what will allow us to face whatever comes next, together rather than alone. Damien met her gaze, something unspoken passing between them. A recognition that the marriage forced upon them by political necessity was beginning to grow into something neither of them had anticipated when they first stood before each other at the altar only days earlier. Their training continued in this manner over the following week, conversations deepening alongside the physical preparation for the coming duel. Elena learned about the history of Damien's pack, the traditions and values that shaped their world. Damien, in turn, began to glimpse fragments of Elena's past, small pieces she allowed to surface as trust slowly built between them, though the full truth of her training and its origins remained carefully guarded, even from him. Meanwhile, word of the impending challenge had begun spreading beyond the walls of the stronghold, carried by messengers and traveling merchants to allied territories throughout the region. Whispers of a human bride, bold enough to accept an ancient challenge against Castor's insult, traveled quickly, generating curiosity, skepticism, and in some quarters, quiet admiration for a woman willing to stand where many others might have retreated in fear. Not everyone within Damien's own pack supported the decision, however. Colin, the younger council member who had voiced hesitation during their earlier meeting, approached Damien privately one evening, his concern evident in his troubled expression. "Forgive me for speaking plainly, my king," he said, "but are you certain this is wise? If she loses this duel, the consequences will fall not only upon her, but upon the entire pack. Our standing among allied territories, the stability of the truce itself, all of it rests upon the outcome of a single contest." Damien considered the young councilman's words carefully before responding. "I understand the risk, Colin. Believe me, I have weighed it many times over these past days, but I have also watched Elena train, watched her prepare with a discipline and focus that surpasses many warriors born into this life. I do not believe we are placing our trust in someone unworthy of it." "And if you are wrong," Colin pressed, though his tone carried more worry than challenge, "then we will face whatever consequences follow, together," Damien said firmly. "But I refuse to spend the coming weeks doubting the woman standing beside me. She has earned better than that from all of us, myself included." Colin said nothing further, though the weight of the king's confidence seemed to settle something within him, a reluctant trust beginning to form where suspicion had lived only days before. As the appointed date for the gathering of allied territories drew closer, tension within the stronghold grew alongside anticipation. Elena continued her preparations with unwavering focus, refining her technique with the staff under both her own guidance and the growing insight Damien offered from his years of combat experience. Their partnership, born from necessity, had begun to feel like something else entirely, something neither of them spoke aloud, but both seemed to sense growing steadily between them with each passing day. Far to the south, within Castor's darker stronghold, preparations of an entirely different nature were underway. Castor had received word of Elena's chosen weapon through spies embedded within allied territories, and the news had done little to ease his confidence. "A staff," he said dismissively when Grant delivered the report. "A weapon for scholars and monks, not warriors. She has chosen poorly, whether she realizes it or not. Do not underestimate a chosen weapon simply because it seems unconventional," Lydia warned from where she sat near the window, her expression thoughtful as always. "A weapon selected with confidence, especially one requiring precision rather than raw strength, suggests someone who understands their own capabilities far better than we currently do." Castor waved away his sister's caution with an impatient gesture. Whatever skill she possesses, it will not be enough to overcome the difference in strength and experience between us, regardless of what weapon she chooses to wield. This duel was never truly about fairness. It was about ensuring the outcome favors our territory, one way or another. Lydia said nothing further, though her private doubts about her brother's overconfidence continued to grow with each passing day, a quiet concern that events might not unfold exactly as he expected once the two combatants finally stood face to face before the watching eyes of every allied territory gathered to witness the outcome. The stage was being set, slowly and deliberately, for a confrontation that would determine far more than the personal honor of a queen, recently arrived in a world she had never known existed only weeks earlier. It would determine the fate of two kingdoms, the fragile peace holding them together, and the true measure of a woman that everyone, on both sides of the growing conflict, had significantly underestimated. The great gathering hall of the Ashford territory, chosen as neutral ground for the formal meeting between the two rival kings, stood filled with representatives from a dozen allied lands by the time Damien and Elena arrived. Banners of every color hung from the rafters, each one representing a different territory, bound together by fragile alliances and centuries of careful diplomacy that Castor's ambitions now threatened to unravel entirely. Elena walked beside Damien through the crowded hall, her expression calm, despite the weight of hundreds of unfamiliar eyes tracking her every movement. She wore a simple dark gown, unadorned by the jewels and elaborate embroidery that marked the other visiting nobility, a deliberate choice she had made that morning, refusing to let anyone mistake decoration for strength. "You do not need to prove anything to these people before the duel even begins," Damien murmured quietly, as they made their way toward the raised platform, reserved for visiting royalty. "I am not trying to prove anything," Elena replied just as quietly. "I am simply refusing to give them a reason to underestimate me, before I have even had the chance to speak." They took their seats, as the hall gradually settled into an expectant hush, the murmur of hundreds of conversations fading, as attention shifted toward the grand entrance at the far end of the room. Moments later, the doors opened, and Castor entered, flanked by his personal guard, his sister Lydia walking a step behind him, and Grant, trailing at the rear, with an expression that revealed little of his private concerns. Castor moved through the hall with the confidence of a man who had never once questioned his own superiority, his eyes sweeping across the gathered crowd until they finally settled on Elena. A slow, mocking smile spread across his face as he approached the platform, stopping directly before Damien and his bride with an exaggerated, shallow bow. "So this is the woman brave enough to accept my challenge," he said, his voice carrying easily through the silent hall. "I confess, I expected someone rather different." Elena met his gaze steadily, refusing to allow even a flicker of unease to show on her face. "And I expected someone whose confidence matched his manners. It seems we are both destined for disappointment today." A ripple of surprised laughter passed through the watching crowd, quickly stifled as Castor's expression tightened, the amusement in his eyes hardening into something colder. He had clearly expected fear, or at the very least deference, not the sharp, unflinching response Elena had just delivered, before an audience of his own peers. "Careful, little queen," he said, his tone losing its earlier mockery. "Words spoken boldly before a duel often sound very different once the fighting begins." "We shall see," Elena replied simply, refusing to give him the satisfaction of a more heated response. Castor held her gaze a moment longer before turning away, moving toward his own seat on the opposite side of the hall, though the flicker of genuine irritation in his expression had not gone unnoticed by those watching closely, including his own sister, whose thoughtful frown deepened as she took her seat beside him. The formal proceedings began shortly after, presided over by an elderly arbiter named Wren, chosen for her long-standing neutrality and deep knowledge of the ancient laws governing royal challenges. She stood at the center of the hall, her voice carrying clearly despite her advanced age, as she outlined the terms both parties had submitted in the days leading up to the gathering. "The challenge stands as follows," Wren announced. "An insult was delivered publicly by King Castor against Queen Elena, consort to King Damien. The Queen has chosen to answer this challenge personally, exercising her right under the ancient law of royal defense. The duel shall take place 3 days from this gathering, upon neutral ground, witnessed by representatives from every territory present in this hall today." She paused, allowing her words to settle before continuing. The queen has selected the traditional fighting staff as her chosen weapon. King Castor's representatives have reviewed this selection and, per the requirements of ancient law, have not formally rejected it as unreasonable. A murmur of surprise rippled through the hall at this revelation. Many of the gathered nobility clearly had not expected Castor's camp to accept such an unconventional choice without objection, and Elena caught a brief exchange of glances between Castor and Grant, a silent communication she could not fully interpret from where she sat. The duel shall continue until one combatant yields, is rendered unable to continue, or death occurs, though all parties have agreed that yielding shall be considered an acceptable and honorable conclusion. Ren continued. Both combatants have agreed to these terms. Does either party wish to raise final objections before this gathering concludes? Silence answered her question. Castor remained still in his seat, his expression carefully neutral once more, while Elena inclined her head slightly, confirming her acceptance of the terms as they had been outlined. Then let it be recorded, Ren said, her voice carrying an air of finality. 3 days from today, at dawn, upon the fields outside these walls, this matter shall be settled according to ancient tradition, witnessed by all territories gathered here today. The formal gathering dispersed shortly after, though the tension within the hall did not fade with the departing crowds. Small clusters of nobility remained scattered throughout the space, whispered conversations, speculating on the outcome of a duel that had captured the attention of every territory represented within those walls. As Elena and Damien made their way toward the exit, a figure stepped into their path, momentarily blocking their passage. It was Lydia, Castor's sister, her expression carrying none of her brother's earlier mockery, only a careful, assessing curiosity. "May I speak with you?" she asked, addressing Elena directly. Damien tensed beside her, clearly uncertain of Lydia's intentions, but Elena placed a calming hand briefly on his arm before nodding. "You may." Lydia glanced around briefly, ensuring their conversation would not easily be overheard, before speaking again, her voice low. "I do not know what skill you truly possess," she said, "but I have watched my brother underestimate opponents before, and it has cost him dearly on more than one occasion. I say this not as a warning against you, but as one, perhaps, in your favor. Whatever you are hiding beneath that calm exterior, do not let his arrogance convince you to reveal more than necessary before the duel itself begins." Elena studied her carefully, searching for hidden motives behind the unexpected words but finding, as far as she could tell, only genuine sincerity. "Why would you offer me such advice?" she asked. "Your brother's victory would serve your own territory's interests far more than mine." Lydia's expression grew distant for a moment, something unreadable passing behind her eyes. "Because I have learned that unchecked pride leads to consequences far beyond what any of us intend," she said quietly. "My brother believes this duel is already decided. I am not so certain he is right, and regardless of the outcome, I would rather see a fair contest than a foolish one built entirely on false confidence." Before Elena could respond further, Lydia inclined her head briefly and turned away, disappearing back into the thinning crowd without another word, leaving both Elena and Damien to ponder the strange exchange in silence. "That was unexpected," Damien said finally, as they resumed their walk toward the waiting carriage outside. "Perhaps not everyone in Castor's court shares his confidence in this outcome," Elena replied thoughtfully. "Or perhaps it was simply an attempt to unsettle you before the duel even begins," Damien countered, though his tone carried more consideration than outright dismissal. "Either way," Elena said, "we have 3 days remaining. I intend to use every one of them." The journey back to their own stronghold passed largely in silence, both of them lost in thought, as the weight of what awaited them in 3 short days settled fully across their minds. Elena stared out the carriage window, watching the passing landscape without truly seeing it, her thoughts already turning toward the training that remained ahead, the final refinements she needed to make before facing an opponent whose strength, by every account she had heard, far exceeded her own. Damien, watching her in silence from across the carriage, found himself studying her expression carefully, searching for any trace of the fear he might have expected from someone facing such an overwhelming challenge. He found none, only a quiet, steady determination that reminded him, unexpectedly, of the warriors he had trained alongside during his own earliest years preparing to inherit the crown he now wore. Whatever doubts remained buried in the depths of his own mind, doubts about the wisdom of allowing her to face this challenge personally, rather than answering it himself, he kept carefully hidden, unwilling to burden her with uncertainty she did not need to carry during these final crucial days of preparation. They would face whatever came next together, exactly as she had promised. And as the carriage carried them back toward the mountains and the stronghold that had, against every expectation either of them once held, slowly begun to feel like something resembling home, Damien found himself hoping, with an intensity that surprised him, that the woman beside him would prove every doubter within that gathering hall entirely, completely wrong. With only 3 days remaining before the duel, Elena understood that whatever preparation she had already completed would not be enough on its own. She needed something more, a level of refinement that could only come from training against someone who truly understood the physical advantages Castor would bring into the fight, someone who could push her beyond the limits of her private practice sessions in ways Damien, despite his own considerable skill, had not yet managed to achieve. It was Nora who suggested the solution on the evening they returned from the gathering hall. "There is a man living on the outskirts of our territory," she said during a quiet meeting in Damien's private study. "His name is Grant, though not the Grant serving within Castor's court. This man once served as a warrior beneath your grandfather's rule, Damien, before retiring many years ago after suffering an injury that ended his fighting days. He trained countless warriors in his time, and though he has lived quietly for years now, few in this territory ever matched his skill with a staff specifically." Damien's expression shifted with recognition. "I remember him. He taught me the basics of staff work when I was young, before circumstances forced my training toward the blade instead. Then perhaps he can offer Elena something neither of us can provide in these final days," Nora suggested. Damien turned to Elena, who had been listening carefully throughout the exchange. "What do you think?" "I think I will take whatever help is offered to me at this point," Elena replied without hesitation. "Pride has no place in preparation. Only results matter now." They traveled to the old warrior's modest home the following morning, a small stone cottage nestled at the edge of the forest bordering their territory. The man who answered the door was elderly, his frame stooped with age, but his eyes remained sharp and alert, missing nothing, as he studied the unexpected visitors standing before him. "Your Majesty," he said, recognizing Damien immediately despite the years that had passed since their last meeting. "It has been a long time." "Too long, old friend," Damien replied warmly. "I have come seeking your help, though the request is unusual." The old warrior listened carefully as Damien explained the situation, his expression growing increasingly thoughtful as the details of the coming duel unfolded before him. When Damien finished, he turned his attention fully toward Elena, studying her with the careful assessment of someone who had spent a lifetime evaluating potential in others. "Show me what you know," he said simply. Elena did not hesitate. She had brought her practice staff with her, and within moments, she moved through a sequence of techniques in the small clearing beside the cottage, the old warrior watching in complete silence throughout the demonstration. When she finished, breathing steady despite the intensity of the display, he remained quiet for a long moment before finally speaking. "Your foundation is solid," he said. "Whoever trained you understood the fundamentals well, but foundation alone will not defeat a warrior of Castor's strength and experience. You need something more, techniques that turn his advantages into liabilities rather than simply defending against them." "Then teach me," Elena said simply. The old warrior studied her a moment longer before nodding slowly, a faint smile crossing his weathered features. "Very well, but understand, 3 days is not nearly enough time under normal circumstances. What I intend to teach you will require complete dedication, every waking hour between now and the duel itself. Are you prepared for that kind of commitment?" "I have spent my entire life preparing for moments I did not fully understand until now," Elena replied. "I am more than prepared." What followed were 3 days unlike anything Elena had experienced during her years of private practice. The old warrior, whose name she learned was simply called Old Burn by those who knew him, pushed her relentlessly through techniques designed specifically to counter an opponent relying on raw physical strength rather than precision or speed. He taught her how to redirect powerful strikes rather than absorb them directly, how to use the length of her staff to maintain distance against an opponent with longer reach, how to identify the subtle tells that preceded a heavy strike, giving her precious fractions of a second to prepare her response. Each session left her exhausted, her muscles aching in ways they had never ached before, but she pushed through the fatigue, understanding that every hour of pain now might mean the difference between victory and defeat when the actual duel arrived. Damien remained present throughout much of the training, occasionally stepping in to spar against her directly, giving Old Byrne the opportunity to observe her technique against an opponent whose size and strength more closely matched what she would face during the actual duel. Their sparring sessions grew increasingly intense as the days passed, both of them pushing each other toward greater precision and speed, though Damien remained careful never to strike with his full strength, mindful of the very real danger such power could pose even during practice. "You are improving faster than I expected," he told her during a brief rest between sessions on the second day, sweat glistening on both their brows despite the cool mountain air surrounding them. "I do not have the luxury of improving slowly," Elena replied, though a faint smile crossed her lips despite the exhaustion evident in her voice. As their training deepened, so too did the connection growing steadily between them, forged through shared purpose and the vulnerability inherent in pushing themselves to their limits before each other's watchful eyes. Conversations during their rest periods grew increasingly personal, walls that had once stood firmly between them beginning to crumble beneath the weight of genuine trust, slowly building through their shared trials. On the evening before the final day of preparation, as the sun set behind the mountains surrounding Old Byrne's small cottage, Elena finally allowed herself to share a piece of her past she had kept hidden, even from Damien, throughout their growing closeness. "My grandmother raised me after my mother passed away when I was very young," she said quietly, staring into the small fire they had built outside the cottage. "My father left shortly after, unable to cope with the loss. I never understood why she insisted I learn to fight, why she seemed to sense danger lurking somewhere in our future, long before any danger actually arrived. She never explained her reasons fully, only told me, before I left to marry you, that I was always meant for more than others could see in me." Damien listened carefully, recognizing the significance of what she was sharing, a piece of herself she had guarded closely since their very first meeting. "Do you think she knew?" he asked gently. "About this world, about what waited for you here?" "I do not know," Elena admitted. "But I have begun to wonder if perhaps she sensed something, some thread connecting our family to circumstances neither of us fully understood at the time. Whatever the reason, I am grateful for her foresight, whatever its true source may have been." Damien reached out, taking her hand in his own for the first time since their wedding day, a small gesture that carried far more weight than either of them might have expected only days earlier. "Whatever happens tomorrow," he said quietly, "I want you to know that I see you now, fully, exactly as you are, not the human bride I once dismissed as a political obligation, but as someone I am genuinely honored to stand beside, regardless of what challenges we face together." Elena met his gaze, something warm and unfamiliar settling in her chest at his words, a feeling she had not expected to find within a marriage that had begun under such cold, calculated circumstances. "Thank you," she said simply, though the sincerity in her voice conveyed far more than the simple words themselves could express. They remained beside the fire a while longer, the growing connection between them settling into something neither of them fully understood yet, but both recognized as significant, a foundation being built alongside the physical preparation that would carry Elena into the most dangerous contest of her life the following morning. As the fire finally burned low, and they prepared to return to the stronghold for what little rest remained before the duel, Old Byrne offered one final piece of guidance, his weathered voice carrying the wisdom of a lifetime spent understanding the true nature of combat. "Remember," he told Elena as she gathered her belongings, "strength is not measured only in the power behind a strike. It is measured in patience, in control, in the ability to remain calm when everything within you screams to react without thought. Castor will expect you to fight with fear, or with desperation. Give him neither. Give him only precision, and let his own overconfidence become the weapon that ultimately defeats him." Elena nodded slowly, absorbing his words with the same careful attention she had given every lesson throughout their intense 3 days together. "I will remember," she promised. As she and Damien made their way back toward the stronghold beneath a sky filled with stars, both of them fell into a comfortable silence, each lost in their own thoughts about what tomorrow would bring. Elena felt no fear as the moment approached, only a quiet, steady readiness born from years of preparation she had never fully understood until now, and days of intense training that had pushed her further than she had ever believed herself capable of reaching. Tomorrow, she would face Castor, before the assembled eyes of every allied territory, carrying not only her own honor into that contest, but the honor of the man walking silently beside her, and the fragile peace that rested upon the outcome of a single, decisive confrontation neither of them could afford to lose. She was ready, and for the first time since arriving in this unfamiliar world weeks earlier, she felt, with complete certainty, that she truly belonged, exactly where she now stood. While Elena trained through those final days beneath old Byrne's watchful guidance, Castor spent his own time in preparation of an entirely different kind, though pride kept him from acknowledging any need for the physical training his opponent had embraced so completely. He gathered his personal guard each morning within the training yards of his stronghold, demonstrating his mastery of the warblade before an audience of loyal warriors who cheered his every strike, reinforcing a confidence that had never once been seriously tested throughout his years of rule. He had defeated every challenger who dared face him in formal combat since claiming his throne, and he saw no reason to believe a human woman, however unexpectedly skilled she had proven herself against a single desperate assassin, would prove any different. Yet despite his outward confidence, private doubts had begun creeping into the edges of his thoughts. Doubts he refused to voice aloud, but could not entirely dismiss either. Lydia's warnings from the gathering hall lingered in his mind more persistently than he cared to admit, and reports from his own spies embedded within Damien's territory spoke of intense training sessions taking place at the edge of the forest, sessions involving not only Elena and Damien, but an elderly warrior whose reputation, though faded with time, had once been considerable. "You seem troubled, brother," Lydia observed one evening, as they shared a quiet meal within the private dining hall of their stronghold. "I am not troubled," Castor replied, perhaps too quickly. "I am simply ensuring my preparations remain thorough. Overconfidence has cost warriors their lives throughout history. I do not intend to become another example." Lydia studied him carefully, recognizing the defensive edge in his tone as evidence of exactly the uncertainty he refused to acknowledge openly. "Perhaps it is not overconfidence you should fear," she said quietly, "but underestimation. There is a difference between the two, and I fear you may still be confusing them." Castor set down his goblet with more force than necessary, irritation flashing briefly across his features before he composed himself once more. "Whatever skill this woman possesses, it changes nothing," he said firmly. "Tomorrow, this matter will be settled, and our territory will finally claim what has rightfully belonged to us for generations. I have waited years for this opportunity. I do not intend to let doubt undermine what I have worked so hard to achieve." Lydia said nothing further, recognizing the futility of continuing an argument her brother had already decided to ignore. But as she retired to her private chambers that evening, her own thoughts remained troubled, torn between loyalty to her family's ambitions and a growing sense that the coming duel might not unfold exactly as her brother so confidently anticipated. Back within Damien's stronghold, the final evening before the duel arrived, with a quiet tension that settled over every corner of the fortress. Elena spent the early evening hours alone in her chambers, reviewing everything she had learned throughout her intensive training, allowing her mind to settle into the calm focus that had always served her well during moments of significant challenge throughout her life. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. She opened the door to find Damien standing in the corridor, his expression carrying a weight she had not seen from him before, something between concern and admiration that he seemed to be struggling to fully express. "May I come in?" he asked. She stepped aside, allowing him entry, and closed the door quietly behind him. For a long moment, neither of them spoke, the silence between them carrying the full weight of everything that awaited them the following morning. "I wanted to see you before tomorrow," he said finally, "not as your king, not even entirely as your husband, but simply as someone who has come to understand, over these past weeks, exactly how remarkable you truly are." Elena felt something warm settle in her chest at his words, a sensation she had grown increasingly familiar with over the days they had spent training and talking together, days that had transformed their marriage from a cold political arrangement into something she was only beginning to understand might carry genuine depth and meaning. "I am frightened," she admitted quietly, the confession surprising even herself. Not of losing exactly, but of what losing might mean for you, for this territory, for the peace so many people are counting on tomorrow's outcome to preserve. Damien stepped closer, taking her hands gently in his own. Whatever happens tomorrow, know that you have already proven something far more important than any duel's outcome could ever measure. You have shown every person watching, myself included, that strength comes in forms far beyond what any of us initially believed possible. Regardless of tomorrow's result, that truth will not change. Elena studied his face carefully, searching for any trace of doubt behind his steady reassurance, and finding none, only genuine conviction that settled her own racing thoughts into something calmer, more centered. "Thank you," she said softly, "for seeing me, truly seeing me, when so many others could not." "I should have seen you from the very beginning," Damien replied, a note of quiet regret entering his voice. "I allowed assumption and prejudice to blind me to who you actually were, and I am sorry for the coldness I showed you during those early days. You deserved better from me then, and I intend to ensure you receive better from me now, regardless of what tomorrow brings." They stood together in comfortable silence for several long moments, the connection between them deepening with each passing second, until finally, Damien pressed a gentle kiss to her forehead, a simple gesture that carried more warmth and sincerity than any of the formal vows they had exchanged during their rushed wedding ceremony weeks earlier. "Rest tonight," he said quietly. "Tomorrow, you will need every ounce of strength and clarity you possess. I will be there beside you, every step of the way, regardless of what unfolds." After he left her chambers, Elena remained standing by the window for a long while, staring out at the mountains bathed in moonlight, her thoughts settling gradually into the focused calm she would need to carry into tomorrow's confrontation. She thought of her grandmother, of the quiet wisdom that had guided her toward years of preparation she had never fully understood the purpose of, until circumstances brought her to this exact moment. "You were always meant for more than they can see," her grandmother's words echoed once more through her memory, carrying new weight now that she stood on the precipice of proving exactly how true those words had always been. She finally lay down to rest as the night deepened around the stronghold, her mind quieting into the disciplined stillness old Byrne had taught her to embrace before moments of significant challenge. Tomorrow would bring the greatest test of her life, a confrontation that would determine not only her own fate, but the fate of two kingdoms locked in a fragile balance that rested now entirely upon her shoulders. She closed her eyes, breathed slowly, and allowed herself, finally, to rest. Tomorrow, she would step onto that field, not as the fragile human bride so many had dismissed upon her arrival, but as a queen who had discovered, through weeks of trial and preparation, exactly how much strength had always lived within her, simply waiting for the right moment to finally emerge. Dawn broke cold and clear over the wide open fields chosen for the duel, mist still clinging to the grass as the first carriages began arriving from every direction, carrying representatives from territories throughout the region who had traveled through the night to witness what many were already calling the most significant royal challenge in generations. Elena rose before the sun had fully cleared the horizon, dressing carefully in simple, practical clothing, designed for freedom of movement rather than ceremonial display. Piper helped her prepare in silence, the younger woman's hands steady now despite the gravity of the day ahead, a quiet confidence in Elena's abilities having replaced the nervous uncertainty from their first meeting weeks earlier. "You will win today, my lady," Piper said softly, as she finished securing the final adjustments to Elena's attire. "I have never doubted it, not since that first night in the Great Hall." Elena offered a small, grateful smile, though her mind remained focused on the challenge ahead, unwilling to allow anything to disturb the careful calm she had cultivated throughout the previous night's rest. "Thank you, Piper," she said simply. Damien met her outside her chambers, his expression carrying the same steady confidence he had shown the evening before, though she could see the concern he carefully kept hidden beneath his composed exterior. He said nothing as they walked together toward the waiting carriage, simply reaching for her hand and holding it firmly throughout the journey toward the fields, where destiny awaited them both. The crowd gathered around the dueling grounds had grown substantial by the time their carriage arrived. Hundreds of spectators forming a wide circle around a flattened section of field marked clearly by wooden stakes driven into the earth, defining the boundaries within which the contest would take place. Banners from every allied territory fluttered in the morning breeze, and the low murmur of hundreds of hushed conversations fell into expectant silence as Damien and Elena stepped down from their carriage. Across the field, Castor had already arrived, standing tall and confident among his own gathered supporters, his warblade resting easily in his grip, as though it were merely an extension of his own arm. He caught sight of Elena approaching and offered a mocking bow, though his eyes carried a wariness he had not shown during their earlier meeting at the gathering hall. Ren, the elderly arbiter chosen to oversee the proceedings, stepped forward to the center of the field, raising her hands to call for silence among the gathered crowd. We gather here today to witness the settling of a formal challenge between King Castor of the Southern Territories and Queen Elena, consort of King Damien, she announced, her voice carrying clearly across the hushed field. The terms have been agreed upon by both parties. This contest shall continue until one combatant yields, is rendered unable to continue, or death occurs, though yielding remains an honorable conclusion accepted by all present. She paused, surveying both combatants carefully before continuing. Do both parties understand and accept these terms as final? I accept, Castor said, his voice booming with practiced confidence across the field. I accept, Elena replied, her own voice steady and clear despite the weight of hundreds of watching eyes. Then let the duel begin, Ren announced, stepping back from the center of the field as the crowd's tension reached its peak. Elena stepped into the marked boundary, her staff held loosely in her grip, her breathing controlled and steady, exactly as old Byrne had trained her throughout their intense sessions together. Across from her, Castor entered the field with the confident swagger of a man who had never once questioned the outcome of any contest he had entered, his warblade gleaming in the early morning sunlight. For a long moment, neither of them moved, each studying the other carefully, searching for weaknesses, testing the silence with careful patience before the first true exchange would begin. You should have let your husband fight this battle for you, Castor said, breaking the silence with a low, mocking tone meant only for her ears. It would have spared you the humiliation you are about to endure. Elena said nothing, refusing to let his words disturb the calm focus she had worked so hard to cultivate. Instead, she simply shifted her weight slightly, adjusting her stance in preparation for whatever came next. Castor's patience broke first. He lunged forward with surprising speed for a man of his size, his blade sweeping in a powerful arc, aimed directly at her exposed side. Elena moved exactly as old Byrne had trained her, sidestepping the strike while simultaneously bringing the end of her staff up to redirect the blade's momentum, sending Castor stumbling slightly off balance from the unexpected force of the deflection. Gasps rippled through the watching crowd. Castor recovered quickly, his expression tightening with the first flicker of genuine surprise since the duel had begun. He attacked again, faster this time, a series of powerful strikes meant to overwhelm her defenses, through sheer relentless pressure rather than careful technique. Elena retreated in a controlled pattern, each step deliberate, each block and deflection precisely calculated to conserve her energy, while absorbing only the minimum force necessary from each of Castor's increasingly frustrated attacks. She could feel the power behind his strikes, far greater than anything she had faced during her sparring sessions with Damien, but exactly as old Byrne had warned her, that power came at the cost of precision, each swing slightly wider, slightly more predictable than a more controlled opponent might have delivered. She waited, patient despite the intensity of the exchange, until she finally recognized the opening she had been searching for. As Castor overextended on a particularly powerful strike aimed at her shoulder, she ducked beneath the blade's arc and drove the end of her staff hard into his exposed ribs, the impact eliciting a sharp grunt of pain from the previously confident king. The crowd's murmur grew louder, disbelief and excitement mixing together as they witnessed something none of them had expected when the duel began. Castor staggered back, clutching his side briefly before straightening, his expression now carrying genuine fury rather than mere confidence. He charged forward again, abandoning the careful patience he had shown at the duel's beginning, his attacks growing wilder, more desperate, driven now by wounded pride rather than calculated strategy. Elena recognized the shift immediately, exactly as old Byrne had predicted might happen if she managed to land an early significant blow. An opponent driven by anger rather than discipline became far more dangerous in raw power, but far less predictable in technique, and far more prone to the exact kind of overextension that created opportunities for someone patient enough to wait for them. She continued her careful defensive pattern, deflecting strike after strike, her staff moving in fluid, practiced arcs that redirected far more force than her physical size would have suggested possible. Sweat began beading on her forehead from the sustained effort, her muscles beginning to burn from the relentless pace of the exchange. But she pushed through the growing fatigue, drawing on reserves of endurance she had built through weeks of intense preparation. The duel stretched on, minutes passing that felt like hours, to the tense, silent crowd surrounding the field. Damien watched from the sidelines, his hands clenched tightly at his sides, every fiber of his being wanting to intervene, despite understanding fully that this battle belonged to Elena alone, and that any interference on his part would violate the sacred terms both sides had agreed to honor. Finally, as Castor's attacks grew increasingly ragged with mounting exhaustion and frustration, Elena recognized the moment old Byrne had spent 3 intense days preparing her to identify and exploit. Castor swung his blade in a wide, powerful arc, overcommitting his weight forward in a desperate attempt to end the contest through sheer overwhelming force. Elena did not retreat this time. Instead, she stepped inside the arc of his swing, closing the distance between them faster than he could adjust, and swept her staff low across his legs, with precisely calculated force. Castor's overextended balance, already compromised by his aggressive strike, could not withstand the sudden sweep, and he crashed to the ground with a heavy, undignified thud that silenced the entire gathered crowd in stunned disbelief. Before he could recover, Elena moved swiftly, placing the end of her staff firmly against his throat, holding him pinned to the ground, exactly as she had once pinned his failed assassin weeks earlier, during that chaotic wedding feast. "Yield," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the silent field, steady despite the exhaustion evident in her heaving breath. Castor stared up at her, disbelief and fury warring across his features, his pride clearly rebelling against the reality of the position he now found himself trapped within. For a long, tense moment, he said nothing, and Elena wondered if perhaps he intended to force the contest toward its more permanent, dangerous conclusion, rather than accept the humiliation of surrender. Then, finally, something in his expression shifted, the fight draining out of him, as the reality of his defeat settled fully into his understanding. "I yield," he said, the words clearly costing him dearly to speak aloud. The field erupted into chaos, hundreds of voices rising simultaneously, in a mixture of astonishment, celebration, and disbelief, as Elena finally stepped back, lowering her staff, and allowing Castor to slowly rise from the ground, his expression carrying the weight of a defeat he had never once imagined possible. Across the field, Damien broke from his position among the sidelines, crossing the distance between them in swift, urgent strides, his expression a mixture of overwhelming relief and unmistakable pride as he finally reached Elena's side. "You did it," he said, his voice thick with emotion he made no effort to hide. Elena, breathing heavily, allowed herself finally to relax, the tension that had carried her through every moment of the intense duel, slowly beginning to release throughout her exhausted body. "We did it," she corrected softly, meeting his gaze with a warmth that had nothing to do with the exhaustion still coursing through her limbs. Around them, the crowd continued its overwhelming reaction, representatives from allied territories already beginning to speak among themselves about the remarkable outcome they had just witnessed. A human queen, who had defeated one of the most feared warriors in the region through nothing more than discipline, patience, and skill that none of them had believed possible from someone outside their own world. Across the field, Castor stood in stunned silence, his pride shattered, before an audience that included every ally he had hoped to impress with his supposed superiority. Beside him, Lydia approached slowly, her expression carrying no trace of the mockery her brother had shown throughout the build-up to this contest, only a quiet, thoughtful acknowledgement of what she had witnessed. "I told you not to underestimate her," she said softly, though there was no satisfaction in her voice, only genuine concern for what this defeat might mean for her brother's fragile pride moving forward. Castor said nothing, his gaze remaining fixed on Elena and Damien standing together, at the center of the field, surrounded now by well-wishers and admirers, eager to congratulate the queen who had, against every expectation, proven herself far stronger than anyone had ever imagined possible. The battle was over. But as Elena finally allowed herself a moment of quiet relief amid the celebrating crowd, she understood, with the same clarity that had guided her throughout the entire contest, that this victory marked not an ending, but a true beginning, one that would carry her and Damien forward, into a future neither of them could have fully anticipated when their reluctant marriage first began, weeks earlier, under such cold, uncertain circumstances. News of Elena's victory spread across every allied territory faster than any messenger could physically travel, carried instead through the excited whispers of the hundreds who had witnessed the duel firsthand, and could not wait to share what they had seen with anyone willing to listen. Within days, the story of the human queen, who had defeated a rival Alpha King in formal combat, had become legend throughout the region, told and retold, with growing embellishment, though the true details of her calm precision and unwavering discipline needed no exaggeration to capture the imagination of everyone who heard them. Back within Damien's stronghold, the atmosphere had transformed entirely from the cold, suspicious tension that had greeted Elena's arrival only weeks earlier. Council members who had once dismissed her as a political liability now sought her counsel directly, recognizing the sharp intelligence and quiet strength that had carried her through a contest few among them believed she could possibly survive, let alone win. Marcus, whose early disdain had been perhaps the most pronounced of anyone within the pack, approached Elena privately, several days after her return, his expression carrying none of the arrogance she remembered from their first uncomfortable meeting. "I owe you an apology," he said, his voice carrying genuine sincerity that surprised her. "I judged you unfairly based on assumptions I should have known better than to make. You have proven yourself far more capable than I, or anyone else within this stronghold, ever gave you credit for." Elena studied him carefully before responding, recognizing the difficulty such an admission likely carried for a man who had built his reputation on unwavering strength and confidence. "Apology accepted," she said simply, "though I would rather earn your respect through continued partnership than dwell too long on past misunderstandings. We have a kingdom to help protect, and I would welcome your experience and guidance as we move forward together." Marcus nodded slowly, something like genuine gratitude crossing his weathered features. "You will have it, my queen. Whatever you need, I stand ready to offer it." Similar transformations played out throughout the following weeks, as Elena settled fully into her role, no longer viewed as an outsider forced upon the pack through political necessity, but embraced increasingly as a queen who had earned her place through demonstrated strength, wisdom, and an unwavering commitment to the people and territory she had sworn to protect. Damien, too, found himself transformed by the weeks of shared trial and growing partnership he had experienced alongside Elena. The cold, guarded king, who had once viewed his human bride as nothing more than an unfortunate political obligation, had given way entirely to a man who genuinely valued her counsel, respected her strength, and had come to care for her in ways he had never expected when their arranged marriage first began. One evening, several weeks after the duel, they sat together on the balcony overlooking the mountains, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant shades of orange and gold, a comfortable silence settling between them that spoke of the deep trust and understanding that had grown steadily since their difficult beginning. "Do you regret any of it?" Damien asked quietly, breaking the peaceful silence. "The circumstances that brought you here, the danger you faced, everything that has happened since your arrival?" Elena considered the question carefully before answering, her gaze remaining fixed on the beautiful scene stretching out before them. "I regret nothing," she said finally. "Every difficult moment led me here, to this exact place, standing beside someone I have come to trust and respect more than I ever imagined possible when I first arrived at these gates weeks ago. My grandmother once told me I was always meant for more than others could see. I understand now, fully, exactly what she meant by those words." Damien reached for her hand, holding it gently within his own, as the last light of the setting sun faded slowly into twilight around them. "I am grateful for whatever fate brought you into my life," he said softly. "I was a fool to ever doubt you, even briefly. You have proven yourself, time and again, to be exactly the partner and queen this kingdom needed, though I confess, I never expected to find in you something even more valuable than strength alone. I found someone I genuinely care for, deeply and completely." Elena turned to face him fully, her expression carrying the same warmth that had grown steadily between them throughout their weeks together. "And I find myself caring for you in return, more than I ever anticipated when this journey began," she replied softly. Far to the south, within his own stronghold, Castor spent the weeks following his defeat in quiet, bitter reflection, his pride severely wounded by an outcome he had never once believed possible. Yet even amid his private humiliation, a grudging respect had begun forming within him, one he found difficult to acknowledge openly, but could not entirely deny either. "You fought well," Lydia told him one evening, finding him alone in the darkened war chamber, where the maps outlining his failed ambitions still hung upon the walls. "I lost," Castor replied bitterly. "You lost to someone whose skill and determination exceeded anything either of us anticipated," Lydia countered gently. "There is no shame in being defeated by genuine strength, brother. The shame would have been refusing to acknowledge that strength when it was so clearly demonstrated before us." Castor considered his sister's words for a long moment, something in his rigid posture finally beginning to soften slightly. "What would you have me do now?" he asked quietly. "Our ambitions toward the northern territories have been thoroughly undermined. Our standing among allied lands has suffered considerably from this defeat." "Perhaps," Lydia suggested carefully, "this is an opportunity, rather than merely a setback. Damien's territory has proven itself formidable, its queen exceptional. Rather than continuing a rivalry that has cost our people so much over the years, perhaps genuine alliance, built on mutual respect rather than conquest, might serve our territory better moving forward." Castor said nothing for a long moment, pride warring visibly against the practical wisdom of his sister's suggestion. But eventually, he nodded slowly, a reluctant acknowledgement that perhaps the path forward required a different approach than the ambitious conquest he had pursued for so many years. "Perhaps you are right," he admitted quietly. "Send word to Damien's territory. Suggest a meeting, one focused on genuine peace rather than the fragile truce we have maintained until now." Lydia smiled softly, relief evident in her expression at her brother's unexpected willingness to consider a new path forward. "I will send the message immediately," she said. Word of Castor's request reached Damien's stronghold within days, met initially with cautious skepticism from the council, still wary of any overture from a territory that had so recently attempted to undermine their queen's very life. But Elena, when consulted, offered a perspective that ultimately shaped the pack's response. "Strength is not proven only through victory in combat," she said, during the council meeting called to discuss the unexpected request. "It is proven through wisdom, through the willingness to build something lasting, rather than clinging to old grievances out of pride alone. If Castor genuinely seeks peace, we should meet that offer with openness, while remaining careful and watchful, ensuring any agreement serves the genuine interests of our people, rather than simply masking continued ambition." Damien, watching her address the council with the same calm confidence and wisdom she had shown throughout every challenge she had faced since her arrival, felt a surge of pride and admiration that had nothing to do with the physical strength she had demonstrated during the duel, and everything to do with the depth of character she continued revealing with each passing day. "We will meet with Castor's representatives," he announced finally, "and negotiate terms that serve the genuine, lasting peace our people deserve." The following months brought significant change throughout both territories, as careful negotiations gradually built toward a genuine alliance, far stronger than the fragile truce that had originally brought Elena into this world weeks earlier, under such uncertain circumstances. Trade between the two lands increased, shared resources strengthened both territories against outside threats, and slowly, cautiously, the old rivalry that had defined relations between their peoples for generations began giving way to something resembling genuine cooperation and mutual respect. Elena, meanwhile, continued growing fully into her role as queen, her reputation extending far beyond the borders of Damien's own territory, as word of her strength, wisdom, and unwavering commitment to justice spread throughout the wider region. She established training programs for young warriors throughout the pack, sharing techniques she had learned from Old Byrne, with a new generation eager to understand the value of discipline and precision over raw strength alone. She worked alongside Nora and Marcus to strengthen the territory's defenses, ensuring that whatever threats might arise in the future would find them far better prepared than they had been during those early uncertain days following her arrival. And alongside Damien, she built something she had never expected to find when she first stepped down from that carriage weeks earlier, uncertain and alone in an unfamiliar world that had seemed, at first, entirely hostile to everything she represented. She built a genuine partnership, rooted in mutual respect, deepening affection, and a shared commitment to the people and territory they now protected together, as true equals. 1 year after her arrival, as the anniversary of that chaotic wedding feast approached, Elena stood once more on the balcony overlooking the mountains, watching the sunset with Damien beside her, exactly as they had done so many times throughout the months since her arrival. The territory below had grown stronger, more prosperous, more secure than it had been in generations, and the fragile alliance with Castor's southern lands had blossomed into genuine friendship between their peoples. I never imagined, when I first arrived here, that I would find exactly the life I was always meant to live, Elena said softly, watching the colors of the sunset paint the sky in familiar, beautiful shades. Nor did I imagine, Damien replied, taking her hand gently in his own, that the human bride I once dismissed so unfairly would become the partner, the queen, and the woman I have come to love more deeply than I ever believed possible. Elena turned to face him fully, her expression carrying the same quiet strength and warmth that had defined her journey from the very beginning, a strength that had once been dismissed, doubted, and underestimated, but had ultimately proven itself, time and again, far greater than anyone, including herself, had ever fully understood. They had once thought her weak. Now, throughout every territory touched by her story, she was known instead as the queen who had defeated a rival Alpha King through nothing more than patience, precision, and an unbreakable determination that had, from the very beginning, always been exactly what she was truly capable of becoming. And as the sun finally set fully behind the mountains, casting the world into the peaceful darkness of another evening, within a kingdom that had grown stronger, wiser, and more united through everything they had faced together, Elena understood, with complete and unwavering certainty, that whatever challenges the future might still hold, she would face them exactly as she had faced everything before, not as someone others could underestimate, but as a queen who had already proven, beyond any doubt, exactly how much strength had always lived within her.